May 1945. Germany is in ruins. The Nazis have been defeated. German soldiers are surrendering to the British Army to avoid capture by vengeful Russians. But the British know that Nazi criminals are hiding among them. They notice a short, middle-aged man wearing an eye patch behaving suspiciously. His identity papers say he is Sergeant Heinrich Himmler. When they confront him, he makes an extraordinary revelation. He takes off his eye patch, replaces it with spectacles, and announces his real name: Heinrich Himmler.
For the people who actually captured Himmler, he's almost as big as Hitler himself. He's one of the most famous / infamous Nazis of them all.
Himmler was totally committed to Hitler's plans for world domination.
Himmler was someone Hitler always trusted. He knew that Himmler would always be loyal to him.
He commanded the most evil organization in history, the SS. It sent millions of people to their deaths.
This is the man who has been in charge of the network of terror, the tentacles of terror.
Starting as Hitler's bodyguard, Himmler grew the SS into a vast organization, a model for a future Nazi state, and he would stop at nothing to create it.
The SS was a central pillar of the Nazi regime in the Third Reich. It was the most violent organization. They carried out the mass crimes. They planned the mass crimes. Without the SS, the Holocaust couldn't have been carried out.
1923, Munich in southern Germany. Armed right-wing nationalists are making a dramatic attempt to seize power, led by Adolf Hitler. One of them is Heinrich Himmler. He's carrying the Nazi flag at the head of Hitler's troops. This is the Beer Hall Putsch, the Nazis' first attempt to overthrow democracy. For Himmler, who fantasizes about being a great military leader, it's the most exciting moment of his life.
Himmler starts out as being a very minor figure indeed in the Third Reich, and he actually is a very conservative, comfortable Bavarian family. So for Himmler to be taking part in a street kind of paramilitary putsch in 1923 is a real quantum shift from anything he's done previously in his career. So he missed out on being involved in the First World War because he was still in training. So this is a real moment when he announces himself in the public sphere and starts to live up to some of these sort of masculine fantasies of being a soldier.
But the Nazis are stopped right here in front of an old war memorial by the police. Bullets fly. 16 of Hitler's men are killed. Himmler is no hero. He flees, dropping the flag on the ground where it's soaked in the blood of the Nazi dead. By chance, Himmler is linked to the Nazi Party's most sacred icon, the blood flag.
Martyrdom was really the essence of a lot of what the Nazis were doing, their rituals. For example, the ritual of the blood flag at Nuremberg, where Hitler carries the flag, and he baptizes every flag of the stormtroopers with the blood flag. So it's a kind of transmission of divine essence.
Himmler's connection with the blood flag is a crucial factor in his rise to power. He joins the stormtroopers, the Nazi Party's paramilitaries. Their job is to take on Hitler's political enemies in the streets. Himmler joins in, but he's out of place among so many hardened brawlers. When Hitler creates a totally new force, he has a chance to make his mark.
The SS roots are in 1923 when Hitler first forms a personal bodyguard to look after him when he's in public, because his appearances are causing increasing agitation on the Munich scene. So it's from this point onwards that you start to see the trajectory of the SS that Himmler picks up with and accelerates.
The new unit is simply called the Protection Squad, Schutzstaffel in German. The SS is born. Himmler exploits his connection with the Blood Flag to be accepted into the SS. What he lacks in military experience, he makes up with his natural organizational skills. In just 4 years, he pushes everyone else aside to become the leader of the SS.
He does seem to have this genius for manipulating people, for administration, for organization, and takes his opportunities when they come. But it is extraordinary how he rises up the ranks and how quickly he does, and how quickly he grips this whole regime within the regime.
In his first 2 years as leader, Himmler expands the SS tenfold to 3,000 members. He founds schools and training academies to indoctrinate new recruits with Nazi ideology, including extreme anti-Semitism. But despite his organization's youth and rapid growth, Himmler portrays the SS as the spiritual descendants of medieval German warriors.
The SS was able to create a myth around their organization. They also consider themselves as an order, so rituals and symbols like daggers were very important. They very often had one element of the German or even Germanic past. You can see this with the names of many SS divisions. So Götz von Berlichingen, Frundsberg, Hohenstaufen were all personalities of medieval times or early modern German history. So each single SS member should consider himself like being part of an old, long tradition dating back centuries.
Himmler doesn't just want the SS to look superior, he wants them to be superior, racially superior. His SS men must prove that they are thoroughly Germanic, with no Jewish ancestors at least as far back as 1800, 1760 for officers. To encourage them to breed more Aryan supermen, Himmler invents a pseudo-pagan SS marriage ceremony. It's all part of his plan to make the SS the dominant elite of the future Nazi state.
Himmler becomes one of the foremost ideologues in Nazi Germany. You can see the SS as being very much kind of like an ideological cavalry of the Third Reich, and perhaps some sort of like priesthood, a possessor of the deeper secrets of the Nazi creed. How far he actually believed in it is impossible to gauge, but he saw it as a very effective political tool. And he sees this as a way to make the SS seem more mysterious, more select, and a means of creating a common ethos amongst the increasingly kind of diverse elements of the SS.
But standing in Himmler's way are the stormtroopers, the original Nazi paramilitaries. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, is a tough war veteran with medals and scars to prove it. He recruits millions of volunteers to fight the Nazi Party's enemies. By 1933, the stormtroopers have become so powerful even Hitler feels threatened by them.
The relations between the Nazi Party and the SA, the brown shirts or stormtroopers, were always a bit fraught. Because the stormtroopers are, in a way, more radical in terms of use of physical force than the Nazis.
The stormtroopers are also more politically radical than most Nazi leaders. Its working-class members believe in the socialist part of National Socialism. They look forward to seizing the aristocracy's land, and Rome boasts about turning his force into a people's army.
Their leader, Ernst Röhm, was making a lot of noises about using the then 4 million strong brown shirts to replace the army, and the army generals say, no, you can't do this.
In the past, Hitler depended on stormtrooper muscle to drive his political enemies off the streets. But in 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor and wants to look more respectable. Röhm and his thugs threaten the establishment Hitler has just joined. They are becoming an embarrassment.
The SA were really not disciplined at all. They were kind of layabouts who just got very, very drunk. People were terrified of them, in fact. They were armed, semi-mutinous thugs. But for a time they served Hitler's interest, and when it didn't serve Hitler's interest, he quite literally, of course, beheaded them.
July 1934. Senior stormtroopers relax at an Alpine hotel. Early in the morning, SS men burst in and arrest Ernst Röhm in his bedroom, along with other stormtrooper leaders. Dazed and in shock, they are executed without trial. The organization never recovers from this night of the long knives. Its independence is over, and stormtrooper membership rapidly declines.
Hitler wanted to get rid of the SA. The SS was seen as much more loyal, and Himmler saw the chance that his SS could fulfill the new central role within the Nazi party, within the Nazi regime. So this is why he supported the Night of the Long Knives.
Vor wenigen Monaten hat sich über der Bewegung ein schwarzer Schatten erhoben. Die SA
Himmler takes advantage of this power vacuum to infiltrate his own men throughout the German state.
What he is able to do is say, look, you don't like those Prussian aristocrats, you don't like the army. This way, we can maintain control. We can be your own personal military. We can be your own personal security office, your intelligence office. We can have control of every part of the state, which means that you have control of every part of the state. And this is incredibly attractive to Hitler, and he thinks, well, great, fantastic.
Himmler now accelerates his plan to establish an SS state. He created the first Nazi security and intelligence organization, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, in 1932. They spy on anyone seen as a threat. Communists, trade unionists, journalists, even Nazi party members are investigated. So when Hitler takes power in 1933, the SD are ready. They already have lists of their political opponents who are arrested and sent to the first SS concentration camp, Dachau.
Dachau is by far the most important of the early Nazi concentration camps because it's the first camp that's set up solely by the SS, and to an extent it's a model for the later SS camps in the 1930s, even up to Auschwitz.
By the summer of 1933, up to 200,000 opponents of the Nazis, again mainly on the left, had been put into concentration camps, beaten up, maltreated. Even the official figures show that 600 were killed.
Prisoners who survive in Dachau are forced to work. They build the camp itself and then produce everything it needs, from furniture to boots. Himmler soon realizes that his captive workforce is a valuable asset. He takes a close interest in the creation and construction of Dachau, visiting it several times.
Dachau becomes probably the SS's most important economic initiative in the 1930s. You have the concentration camp itself, you have an enormous training barracks for concentration camp guards, and you have the prisoner labour. And here you see kind of the first roots of deployment of prisoner labour for economic purposes that you would see flourish throughout the system.
Prisoners are soon forced to turn out a range of goods for the commercial market. The SS even corners the bottled water market.
The SS becomes more and more powerful. It takes on all kinds of different functions. It has a whole economic empire. Himmler, for example, was a freshwater fanatic. He didn't believe in alcohol, and the most popular German mineral water, called Apollinaris, became part of the SS economic empire. I can never drink a glass of Apollinaris without thinking about this.
As his business empire grows, Himmler also gains power over state security. Hermann Goering creates his own secret state police from the political and intelligence sections of the Prussian police in 1933. Within a year, Himmler wins control of it. It's known as the Gestapo. Its headquarters on Prince Albert Street in Berlin becomes notorious. Today, a memorial stands in its place. In the 1930s, this building and the men who work here strike terror into all who oppose the Nazis.
Die geheime Staatspolizei hat in ihrem Hauptquartier hier im
The Gestapo set up a prison here in the basement of the southern building. There were 38 single cells and a larger common cell. Here, people were held for the duration of their interrogation by the Gestapo. When someone was arrested by the Gestapo, he was brought here, and it was the Gestapo's aim to get them to talk as quickly as possible. During the interrogation, there would be brutal torture. Torture was always an integral part of the investigation. It was normal. So normal, in fact, that the work of the Gestapo was well known by the German public. When you think of the title of the Gestapo, the secret state police, you get the impression that it was an organization that worked in secret, identifying hidden enemies of the regime. And to some extent they did that, of course. But the Gestapo was anything but a secret organization. They operated in the open. Their work was reported in the newspapers, so the people definitely knew the Gestapo existed and what its job was. In 1936, Hitler makes a fateful decision. He centralizes control of all the existing local and regional police forces under Himmler, hugely increasing his empire.
Himmler soon not only controlled his own SS, but also the police. So police and SS did not merge. There were still two separate organizations, but all under one umbrella.
German police, just like any other police service, it has its detectives, its plainclothes policemen, the criminal police. It has its ordinary day-to-day policemen who do traffic, who do home security, all sorts of safeguarding the welfare of the people. All that gets incorporated into the SS as well.
Himmler now controls the regular uniformed police, armed paramilitary units, as well as thousands of detectives. They don't resist Himmler's takeover.
The police forces were generally much more positive towards Nazism and their ideology than, for instance, the army. This also helped this process to integrate the police into the SS.
The SS starts like this and it just goes, and until it's got its arms and tentacles into literally every single aspect of the Third Reich.
The whole of Germany's security apparatus is now firmly under Himmler's control. The Nazis deploy all these state forces to implement their racial policies. Their aim is to purify the country.
They proceeded to purge the German people from elements which they considered alien, such as Jews, homosexuals, and so on. And the SS and their various sub-organizations like the security services, the Gestapo, played a crucial role in this.
November 9th, 1938. Himmler orders the Gestapo and SD to orchestrate a nationwide attack on Jewish businesses and synagogues. His men destroy thousands of buildings and murder hundreds of Jews. They send 30,000 more to concentration camps. So many shop windows are broken that the attacks become known as the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. Many Germans find the violence shocking, but that didn't mean they sympathized with the Jews.
The sight of smashed shops, of broken glass, of buildings being burnt, of disorder, of things getting out of control, disturbed a lot of people. But one has to distinguish between distaste for some of the public acts of anti-Semitic violence and being willing to look the other way, being indifferent to violence being done to the Jews.
So even though Germans hate disorder, Himmler now knows they tolerate his persecution of the Jews. To consolidate his power further, he creates the Reich Security Head Office, or RSHA, basing it here at the Gestapo HQ in Berlin. The Nazis have now totally penetrated all the country's security forces. This was the center of the SS and the police, the center of Himmler's SS state. The most important thing about the Reich Security Head Office was that state institutions, namely the Gestapo and the criminal police, were brought together with a party organization, the security service of the SS, the SD. And this is a typical characteristic of this apparatus of terror and also of the Nazi regime, this linking of party and state institutions.
That's a kind of coordination of the entire security apparatus in Nazi Germany, and it does give them a great deal of power, which grows and grows during the war. And some historians have even said it was sort of starting to swallow up the normal apparatus of the state.
Gestapo offices across Germany become local command centres for Himmler's SS state. Nazi terror was now systematically applied from places like this, the regional Gestapo office in Cologne.
On the one hand, there is this bureaucratic terror, which took place in the offices. People were recorded, lists were written, people were summoned and interrogated, and when they were suspect in the eyes of the Gestapo, heavily tortured, sometimes in the offices. But most importantly, there were these cells. The cells were used very consciously for intimidation, especially in the mid-1930s. People were brought here without any judicial process, with no access to a lawyer, and then they were sitting in these cells and often did not even know what they were accused of.
One community is particularly targeted by the Gestapo. The Nazis despise the Roma and Sinti, popularly known as gypsies. They portray them as incorrigible thieves and vagrants.
It was a very, very small minority of the population, really fractional percentage. And they had kind of kept themselves to themselves in their way of life. And it was a way of life that didn't fit very comfortably or very easily with the German settled population. It became very clear, actually quite early on, from 1934, 35, from those kinds of years onwards, that the Nazis wanted a clean Germany without a sullied image, and that involved removing the Sinti and the Roma. And that was in many cities, Cologne and others.
To satisfy Himmler's obsession with racial distinctions, all the physical details of Roma and Sinti families are measured and recorded before they are sent to concentration camps. The techniques first used during the rounding up and transportation of the Sinti and Roma will be perfected during the Holocaust, when millions of other racial undesirables will be exterminated.
It's important to take into account that there was more than one genocide going on. So the Nazi extermination of Europe's Jewish population, that was one genocide. At the same time going on was the genocide of the Sinti and Roma. And they called it the Paraimos. That was their great devouring, their equivalent of the Shoah. So of gypsy victims, in total, a figure of around 1 million. So 1 million Sinti and Roma victims of National Socialism across Europe from the occupied territories.
On August 31st, 1939, Polish troops strike at this German radio station in Gleiwitz. The attack is reported by German radio news and even the BBC. Hitler is furious and orders the invasion of Poland in retaliation. But, of course, the Gleiwitz attack is a fake, part of an elaborate SS deception plan, Operation Himmler. The attackers are really German SD agents dressed as Poles. They seize control of the radio station, then broadcast a garbled anti-German message in Polish. Finally, the Nazi agents dump several bodies at the scene. Nazi propaganda claims these are the Polish attackers. The truth is much more sinister.
Around a dozen prisoners from Sachsenhausen are murdered, dressed up in Polish uniforms, as evidence of a Polish border incursion, and therefore justifying the declaration of war against Poland.
Himmler has given Hitler the excuse he wants to launch his war in the east. The German army rolls across the border into Poland, a dramatic conquest ahead of them. Himmler wants his men to lead the way. His plan is to turn his secret policemen and concentration camp guards into an elite fighting force, the Waffen-SS. These entrance posts at Germany's National Archives hide a sinister reminder of its Nazi past. Beneath the concrete stand two huge statues of SS men. Because 70 years ago, this was the barracks of Hitler's elite SS bodyguard, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. They may look impressive, but these are far from being super soldiers.
Nazi propaganda had always portrayed the Waffen-SS as an elite force. However, reality was quite different, particularly in the early days of the war. The SS was not very well equipped, their training standards were absolutely poor, and the quality of the officers' corps was also very low. Very often, SS officers were former army officers or NCOs who were seen as second class or third class, and there was no real perspective of a great career, so that's why they joined the SS.
The Leibstandarte and two other SS regiments take part in the conquest of Poland. Himmler believes they are more than ready to carry the SS emblem onto the battlefield, but appearances are deceptive.
They look more efficient than they are. They're the first people to have camouflage, which Himmler immediately patents. But just having the kit doesn't make you a soldier. The problem with the kind of militarized units of the SS, which then later becomes the Waffen-SS, is that their whole organization, their whole leadership is based around people who simply don't have the experience of that leadership. So what you don't get is good military, tactical and operational leadership. And that is really shown up in terms of their lack of military training, lack of military prowess. And they have to learn the hard way through bitter experience before they become pretty efficient.
Normal army generals and officers got really fed up with them because they would storm into the enemy without any thought for themselves and be mown down in huge numbers, whereas the conventionally trained military men were saying, hold back, let's have some tactics here. So in many ways they weren't that effective. They were just too fired up, really, to engage in military offensives in a rational way.
In just over 5 weeks, the German military crushes Polish resistance. The SS do not distinguish themselves on the battlefield, but they do massacre hundreds of Jewish civilians behind the lines to Himmler's satisfaction. Then Gestapo agents and SD men draw up lists of prominent Polish leaders who must be arrested and executed. The job is given to 5 so-called action groups, or Einsatzgruppen.
The Einsatzgruppen are drawn from various parts of Himmler's organization. So you have some SD men, you have concentration camp guards, on secondment, you have some policemen, and they're essentially involved in operations against the Polish elites, against the intelligentsia, so against clerics, against army officers, and increasingly also against Jews, who are perceived always by the Nazis to be implicitly a kind of a malevolent opposition leadership.
The 3,000 men of the Einsatzgruppen murder more than 60,000 Poles by the end of 1939. Then they force Poland's Jews into improvised ghettos all over the country. Thousands die in the brutal roundup. Many more will die of malnutrition and disease in the years to come. The SS are moving ever closer to their final solution. But Himmler craves an even greater military role. So he convinces Hitler to allow him to increase the number of his combat troops. When the Blitzkrieg is unleashed on Western Europe in May 1940, 3 full SS divisions are ready to take part. One is the Totenkopf, or Death's Head Division, formed from former concentration camp guards. On the 26th of May 1940, they capture 96 British soldiers in the French village of Le Paradis and massacre them.
That is part of the SS culture. When you are a camp guard at Dachau, for example, you're used to treating your enemies like dirt. These are people to be despised, to be spat on, kicked, beaten, executed if they step out of line. And as far as the commander of the Paradis, for example, was concerned, those British men had stepped out of line. So therefore he lines them up against the wall and shoots them.
The massacre is not a one-off. 2 days later, members of the Leibstandart SS division murder another 80 British soldiers. Yet, far from being condemned, these men win high praise from Hitler, who tells them, "Henceforth it will be your privilege to lead every German attack." He's already planning an assault on the regime he hates above all others, the Soviet Union. Hitler believes the ruthlessness of Himmler's combat units will be vital for his campaign.
Hitler believed very much in the power of the will, and so therefore you had to be aggressive, and if the enemy was going to overwhelm you, if you were strong enough, if your willpower was great enough, you could beat them back. What distinguished the Waffen-SS was above all their fanaticism. They were highly ideological. The kind of training they went through was very brutal, very political kind of training.
Waffen-SS units were generally much more likely to commit atrocities than ordinary Wehrmacht units. This was partly, at least partly, due to indoctrination, or to be more precise, one element of indoctrination in Nazi ideology. I would call it a cult of toughness. So you have to be tough against yourself, but also you have to be tough against the enemy. You always see the world in black and white. So those who are not for you are against you, and you can treat them ruthlessly, or you have to treat them ruthlessly.
June 22nd, 1941. The all-out attack on the Soviet Union begins. By now, the Waffen-SS has expanded to 6 divisions. 1 or 2 of them are attached to each of the 3 invading army groups. Their tenacity in defense and ferocity in attack finally earns them a reputation as elite forces.
4 of the core divisions of the SS, the Leibstandarte, das Reich, Totenkopf and Viking, all became motorized divisions and later armored divisions. This meant they could be used as a mobile reserve. So every time in a time of crisis on the Eastern Front, Waffen-SS divisions were rushed in or were sent in order to solve the crisis.
But just as in Poland, combat divisions are not the only SS units which invade. Once again, Einsatzgruppen are formed to implement the Nazis' brutal racial policy.
It is these police battalions which are providing most of the Einsatzgruppen, which are action squads designed to follow up behind the armed forces, before the ground forces, and execute people. That is their job. Round up Jews, Slavs, anyone they don't like, the intelligentsia of Poland, kick them into pits, shoot them in the back of the head, all that kind of stuff. That is being carried out by the ordinary police, but they are part of the SS.
These ordinary men are soon committing extraordinary crimes. The 500 men of a single unit, Police Battalion 101, execute 83,000 people.
Very quickly, the Einsatzgruppen escalates from shooting males to also executing women and children if they happen to be Jewish. And so you have a kind of a self-radicalization, it seems, within the Einsatzgruppen very early on. And here we can see quite clearly a Holocaust by bullet.
Shortly after the invasion begins, Himmler makes a special trip to the Eastern Front. He wants to find out how effectively the Einsatzgruppen are carrying out the mass killings he's ordered. But he is deeply disturbed by what he sees.
Himmler in August 1941 witnesses one of these mass executions and is really upset by it. He doesn't like seeing all this blood and horror. And he thinks, those poor men having to carry out those executions, it must be very traumatic. We've got to find a better way of doing this. There must be a more humane way so that my guys, my boys, don't get traumatized by this. The concern is not at all with the victims. It is entirely with the people who are having to do this traumatic mass executions.
This is raw, brutalized personal killing on a nightmarish scale. You have relatively small groups of men who are shooting thousands and thousands of people every day. And the psychological impact of this on any kind of member of the Einsatzgruppen is enormous. And this helps to pave the way to the search for a more humane, from the point of view of the Nazi perpetrators, way of accomplishing Himmler's genocidal goals.
October 13th, 1941, Himmler orders the construction of a totally new SS institution, purpose-built death camps. First Belzec, soon followed by Treblinka and Sobibor. They are specifically designed to murder thousands of Jews in poison gas chambers as soon as they arrive. In January 1942, the decision is taken to exterminate all of Europe's Jews. More camps are needed. Chelmno, Auschwitz and Majdanek. 3 million people are thought to have been murdered at these 6 camps alone. Over the gates of many camps is fixed the slogan "Arbeit macht frei," work will set you free. For those executed immediately at the death camps, it is a vicious lie. But some prisoners are selected for work. Himmler plans to turn even some of the death camps into profitable ventures by exploiting a growing German crisis, a massive shortage of workers.
This does happen at a time when most male German labour is being called up to the Wehrmacht. Basically the idea that the SS controls a vast number of prisoners, it would be a good idea to extract more labour from them before they actually perish.
The SS gets involved in the business of the exploitation of labor. The concentration camps become effectively labor exchanges. I mean, they are hiring out their prisoners on the cheap. The employers and the major German companies who are doing this don't have to pay very much, and they're able to make use of hundreds of thousands of slave laborers.
Every concentration camp forges close ties with local industries.
In 1942-1943, you get a very large number of satellite camps which gather around the concentration camps and generally based at firms or at particular resources where the prisoners can be put to work on a much wider scale. And here you'll find almost all the major German companies have some kind of involvement in a satellite camp.
IG Farben, its plant at Auschwitz, is the most notorious example of that, but there were other companies. Siemens had a factory there as well. And so IG Farben basically has its own private concentration camp that is run by the SS, is outsourced to the SS.
IG Farben, the largest chemical company in the world at the time, employs thousands of Auschwitz prisoners to build and operate a synthetic rubber plant. And it is not alone.
This is very much emblematic of a wider attitude of German commerce and business towards prisoner labour as a resource to be used. So there's a resource here that companies can say, we should use, because if we don't, somebody else will. And we have a responsibility to contribute towards the German war effort and to protect the profits of our shareholders.
The Mauthausen concentration camp perfectly demonstrates the brutal SS business model. Prisoners were first sent here from Dachau in 1938 to work in the granite quarry. But Mauthausen rapidly expands to become one of the Nazis' largest labour camp networks, with nearly 100 subcamps spread across Austria and southern Germany. Stone from the quarry is first used to construct the camp. Once completed, the SS starts selling stone on the open market, making a big profit.
The SS did have its own empire, economic empire, especially in the East, and that was focused on a combination of producing certain types of things, craft goods, stonemasonry, all sorts of things like that. So they were producing these goods, but they're also using up the humans in the process of that. And this idea of killing people through work is something that is developed in the SS.
Mauthausen is far from being a normal business. Every block of granite is chiseled from the quarry by hand. Then the inmates are forced by the SS to carry them up the Stairway of Death. For the sick and starving prisoners, carrying stone blocks up 186 steps is effectively a death sentence. But the SS policy of exterminating racial enemies through work conflicts with its other top priority, making money.
And so there's an attempt to transform, to some extent, the camp's culture of death, basically make the prisoners live longer and produce more. But it's very difficult to actually affect any kind of meaningful change because the cultures of the camps are wired very much towards killing rather than preserving prisoners. They're too punitive, really, to extract labour in any kind of rational sense.
Yes, it's a concentration camp, not a death camp. There aren't gas chambers there. But the people there are as sure going to die as the people being led straight to the gas chambers. It's just a stay of execution. The whole point is to just get these people in, work them to death, and then get another bunch in. So that you've got this constant cycle of prisoners and slave labour coming in and doing your work for you.
Mauthausen becomes notorious for its appallingly high death rate, so its labour force has to be constantly replenished. Political opponents of the Nazis are brought here from across Europe, including many resistance fighters and even thousands of Italian soldiers.
When Italy was defeated and surrendered in the summer of 1943, the entire Italian army was carted off to Germany to man factories, where they had a very hard time because German workers resented them. They thought they'd let the side down by surrendering.
They're using these people, treating them like absolute filth, grinding them into the dust, so much so that it's actually called the bone grinder.
Himmler inspects Mauthausen during 1941, its most productive phase. Trading with 45 major companies, it is one of the Nazis' most lucrative concentration camps. In 1944, it generates more than 11 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to about $140 million today. But the human cost is also enormous. 300,000 prisoners die in the process.
What's particularly chilling about the whole thing is the application of modern management techniques as time goes on to more effectively exploit people until they die, so that you get more production out of them by using these modern management techniques, but the assurance of death in the end, or of wearing people out completely, is there as well.
By 1945, Himmler's SS business empire controls 500 firms. Its slave laborers are now a common sight all over the Reich, but they are not enough to supply Germany's ever more desperate need for workers. So millions of other people are shipped to Germany from the occupied territories to become forced laborers.
Forced labour becomes increasingly necessary for a regime which is sending literally millions of men into their deaths on the Eastern Front. And so the more men need replacing in the factories and on the fields of Germany, the more labourers are forced to come in. So there's 7 million foreign workers in Germany by 1944.
70 years ago, this was part of GBI Camp 75-76. These barrack buildings housed up to 2,000 forced workers. The camp is in the middle of a residential area, so the primitive living conditions and harsh treatment of the inmates would have been obvious to local Germans. And this is just one of 3,000 camps that housed forced laborers in Berlin alone.
Virtually the whole of the economy by 1944 becomes dependent upon labor which has been brought to Germany with various degrees of coercion. To some extent, these people have been enticed by promises of decent conditions and decent incomes. To some extent, people are just rounded up off the streets and hauled away into the country. And as I say, by the later stages of the war, this is what kept the German war economy going.
At Gestapo headquarters in Cologne, the cell walls bear the names of forced workers from all over Europe. They are imprisoned for many offences, from illegal sexual relationships to more serious charges such as sedition or even sabotage.
As the war went on, the situation got worse and worse. The cells were getting fuller and fuller. They were no longer imprisoned in ones or twos, but 5, 6, 10 in a cell. We know from an inscription which a Frenchman left behind that once there were even 30 people locked up together.
In der Bevölkerung war natürlich sehr schnell das LD-Haus absolut berüchtigt.
This building became infamous among local people. You would hear about the prisoners who were locked up here. You were afraid of these Gestapo men. You were worried that you would be picked up and maybe never come back again. That was very intimidating. Then we have reports of people who passed by in the streets outside who could hear screaming coming from the cells. In the last months of the war, those still living in the surrounding houses could look into the courtyard and actually see prisoners being executed.
In the final months of the war, the Reich Security Head Office allowed local Gestapo officers to execute non-Germans without needing permission from Berlin first. After this, hundreds of foreign workers were executed here. With the power of life or death over millions of civilians, the SS has reached the peak of its power. It has an enormous industrial empire and almost 1 million men under arms. But to get the Waffen-SS up to this size, Himmler's previous insistence on Aryan purity has been abandoned.
Himmler's very dependent on taking what the army won't take, or using people who've already served their spell in the army and bringing them into the SS. And he has to trawl through Europe finding ever more spuriously plausible folkish Germans in order to bring them into the Waffen-SS.
The SS now recruited people who they considered racially inferior to them, and they formed their special SS units, be it Ukrainians, be it even French, be it Muslims from the Balkans, and so on. However, with the exception perhaps of the Estonians and to a certain degree of the Latvians, these SS units always underperformed, so they can definitely not be seen as military elite.
When the British and Americans land in Normandy in June 1944, they smash the SS panzer divisions. As the Waffen-SS collapses, Himmler's empire crumbles.
As a Waffen-SS soldier, being tough against you meant you do not surrender. So it was explicitly forbidden for SS soldiers to surrender. In reality, they often did, of course.
But Hitler still has faith in Himmler. In January 1945, he gives him what he has craved all his life, a major military command. He's put in charge of an army group with orders to hold back the Soviet advance on Berlin. But Himmler proves to be no better a soldier than many of his SS troops.
Himmler's fall from grace starts when he takes command of the army group Vistula in 1945 and performs disastrously, even given the adverse conditions which he's facing on the Eastern Front, breaks down with hypochondriac stomach complaints, has to go off to a sanatorium to convalesce, and his grip on the empire is gone.
Totally out of his depth, Hitler dismisses him from his army command after less than 2 months. After more than 20 years, the bonds of loyalty between the two most senior Nazis are starting to break.
Himmler's track record in the final months of the Third Reich really showed his character for what it was: grasping, insincere, treacherous and evasive. And here you find the empty, brittle hollowness of Himmler and his insincerity, and it comes some way to the bankruptcy of the whole SS ideology.
As the Red Army closes on Berlin, some SS men prepare for its final defense, even though they are not German. They include Frenchmen from the SS Charlemagne division, alongside recruits from Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and Baltic states. But their leader will not be with them. Incredibly, Himmler has started secret negotiations with the Allies behind Hitler's back. Hitler is enraged. He strips Himmler of all of his titles, expels him from the Nazi Party, and orders his arrest. Himmler tries to escape.
This is very cowardly behaviour he reveals from negotiations with the Allies, right through to his final few days where he wanders into British captivity, dressed, as one of his subordinates said, like a character from a bad detective novel.
Disguised as Sergeant Heinrich Himmler, Himmler is finally stopped at an improvised checkpoint by a group of Soviet-forced labourers. They hand him over to the British Army. When he arrives at an interrogation camp, Himmler finally admits his true identity.
So for the people who actually catch him, before their eyes is this rather pathetic-looking man with no chin and a kind of rather feeble moustache and myopia. You're thinking, really? Is this him? Is this the great Heinrich Himmler, the man who's had so much power in his hands, and he's reduced to this?
While being examined by an army doctor, Himmler bites on a cyanide capsule. There's a desperate struggle to remove the poison, but within minutes, Himmler is dead. He has cheated justice to the disappointment of both his victims and fellow perpetrators.
A lot of the SS men felt betrayed that Himmler didn't actually go before the dock in Nuremberg and account for the organisation. So Hitler's already dead, and now Himmler's gone as well, so their spokesmen have vanished.
As the concentration camps are liberated, Himmler's horrific legacy emerges. The Nazis forced their victims into more than 40,000 camps and ghettos. Between 15 and 20 million people were imprisoned or killed in them.
The SS was a central pillar of the Third Reich and the Nazi regime. It was the most violent organization. It was the brain and the tool for all the mass crimes. Or in other words, without the SS, the Holocaust couldn't have had happened.
Heinrich Himmler's body was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in northern Germany. All trace of it has been lost. His millions of victims, however, should never be forgotten.